Olá, boa tarde a todas, boa tarde a todas, boa tarde a todos. Eu sou Yuri Castelfranchi, que não conhece ainda nossas lives, são do curso Amerec. O Amerec é o curso de especialização da UFMG em comunicação pública da ciência. A gente forma jornalistas científicos, educadores científicos, divulgadores da ciência. E esse seminário avançado e live do Amerec, dedicado especificamente a um projeto do MIT, em que a gente dará apoio, fará uma parceria para traduzir esse curso de letramento e leitura online e digital em parceria com eles. Então, vou logo apresentar nossos convidados de hoje, que são Joe Braxton, diretor do Stanford History Education Group. Ele é a pessoa que supervisionou a criação do currículo do curso Core, que é o que vamos falar hoje, o Civic Online Reasoning, que ajuda os alunos a separar notícias falsas online por meio de estratégia e checagem de fatos. Bem-vindo, Joel. Good morning, good evening. E temos juntos com Joe, Natasha Esteves, que é estudante de pós-graduação no programa de Learning Design, Innovation and Technology, na Escola de Graduação de Harvard, e assistente de pesquisa no Laboratório de Sistemas de Ensino do MIT. Ela foi professora, educadora por uma década, e agora trabalha na condução de pesquisas qualitativa e auxilia na disseminação do curso do Civic Online Reasoning no Brasil, que é o tema de hoje. A seguir, nós temos Marvez, estudante de pós-graduação no programa de Estudos Comparativo de Mídia do MIT, e que tem trabalho focado em ajudar na preparação de professores por meio de simuladores de conversação digital. Ela tem experiência em pesquisa, design de jogos, educação, processamento de linguagem natural, biotecnologia e estudos sociais. Good evening, Marvez. You're welcome. E a seguir, Joshua Littenberg Tobias, que é pesquisador no Laboratório de Sistemas de Ensino do MIT. Sua pesquisa é focada em medir a aprendizagem em ambientes mediados por tecnologia, e estudar a transferência de aprendizagem para ambientes não digitais. O trabalho dele no MIT se concentra no projeto e implementação de aprendizagem online, com foco na equidade e na participação cívica. Então, sejam muito bem-vindos, welcome everyone. A discussão de hoje será bilíngue, principalmente em inglês, obviamente nossos convidados falarão principalmente em inglês. Tentaremos auxiliar, acompanhar nos comentários no YouTube com traduções parciais, alguns dos slides estão em português também, e todos vocês que assistem se sintam confortáveis em colocar suas questões e perguntas, quem preferir, em português. Aí, na fase final de discussão, eu vou ajudar com uma tradução simultânea para nossos palestrantes. Então, a parte final pode ser conduzida em português, para quem se sentir mais confortável assim, e na fala deles, alguns dos slides serão também em versão bilíngue, para ajudar todo mundo a se sentir mais confortável. Nós temos em projeto um maior webinar, no começo do ano que vem, sobre o curso, e esse será totalmente bilíngue, com tradução simultânea em 2 canais de áudios. Então, fiquem preparados para acompanhar mais sobre esse tema, e dessa vez em formato bilíngue completo. So then I give the word to Joshua to make the brief introduction to our talk today, and I share only the adequate slide for this. Let me see. Yes, I think it's okay, Joshua.
Great. Thank you so much. A very good afternoon, good evening. Very excited to be here today with all of you to talk a little bit about a new project that we're working on to adapt an existing online course for the Brazilian context. I'm really excited to be joined here today by my colleagues, Marvez and Natasha from MIT and Joel Breakstone from Stanford University. I'm going to start with this sort of brief agenda for what we're going to be covering today, and then I will hand it over to my colleague Joel. So if you could put on the next slide. So we're going to start with some background on Civic Online Reasoning and some of the research behind Civic Online Reasoning and why these strategies for detecting online misinformation are effective and grounded in research, and that will be presented by Joel Breakstone. Then Marvez and I are going to give a brief introduction into the Sorting Truth from Fiction course, which is currently available in English. We'll talk a little bit about the course itself and some of the research underlying that course. And then Yuri will be giving a introduction into the project to adapt this into Portuguese for the Brazilian context. And then finally, we'll have a short feedback survey just so we can get your impressions on this session. We'll have time for questions and answers. So we're very excited to have you all here today. And now I'm going to hand it over to my colleague.
Thanks so much, Josh. Good afternoon, good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you and to have an opportunity to talk a little bit about the Civic Online Reasoning curriculum that is at the heart of this course. I am from the Stanford History Education Group. We are a research and development team based at the Graduate School of Education at Stanford University. And for the last 6 years, we've been working to figure out strategies to help people be more discerning consumers of online information. Unfortunately, in recent years, there's been no shortage of examples showing why it's so important to help people figure out how to sort fact from fiction online. In the United States, there's been clear evidence from a United States Senate investigation that during the 2016 presidential election, when Donald Trump was elected president, that Russia was targeting African Americans in the United States in an effort to suppress their vote, to tamper with the American democracy. Similarly, during the course of the COVID-19 pandemic, we have seen repeated evidence that the people are being provided with deeply problematic content about the kinds of cures and medicines that they can turn to people can turn to in order to try to treat COVID-19. For instance, online people have been selling a variety of cures that include things like chlorine bleach, deeply troubling. In short, it is incredibly clear that that both our health and our democracies are threatened by the ongoing spread of toxic content online. Unfortunately, there is a very durable perception that young people in particular are better equipped to make sense of online information because they grew up with digital devices. In the United States, one prominent publication, Politico, said, to be sure, Gen Z, young people, teens and 20-somethings, don't need lessons on how to use the internet. They aren't falling for the same fake news stories that may have duped their parents 5 years ago. We've actually completed a national study here in the United States with more than 3,000 high school students, and we asked them to complete a variety of evaluations of real online sources. And the results were really distressing. Across the board, students struggled to make even the most basic evaluations of digital content. Just as one example, when we showed students this website, co2science.org, it's a website that claims to be disseminating factual reports about issues related to the climate. But they deny humans' role in global warming. And if you just stayed on their website, they might seem credible. They list lots of scientists who are affiliated with them, who have PhDs, and they publish a variety of papers about their work. But as soon as you leave the website and turn to the internet, which students could do at any time, you quickly discover that CO2 science is a project of an organization that receives funding from oil companies, groups that have a vested interest in this issue. They don't want to see more limitations on emissions. However, when we asked those more than 3,000 high school students whether or not this was a trustworthy source of information to learn about global warming, 96% of those students never found that link to fossil fuel companies. That's problematic, right? If we want people to be able to make good decisions about issues that affect themselves and their communities, they need access to trustworthy information. And this research makes it really clear that young people are not yet prepared to do that. That's alarming. However, we didn't end just by having the research showing that that lots of people struggled to evaluate online sources. We wanted to figure out how we can help students do better. And to do that, we set out to figure out, what does expertise look like in terms of evaluating sources online? And we wanted to watch 3 different groups of people as they evaluated online sources so that we could get a better sense of the kinds of approaches that were effective in identifying credible sources on the internet. And those 3 groups that we turned to were freshmen at Stanford University, so young people who were in the heart of Silicon Valley, many of whom were going to go on to work at tech companies, and then history professors, folks who spent all day evaluating sources from archives and other historical locations. And then finally, professional fact checkers, people who worked at some of the United States' most prominent news organizations. And we wanted to see how they went about evaluating unfamiliar sources. And so what we asked them to do was to look at some sources and to think out loud as they went about evaluating them. And we recorded their screens as they did so. So for instance, we asked them to look at this article from a website called minimumwage.com. Minimumwage.com looks like it's a credible source. They have a very attractive, professionally designed website. If you go to the About tab, you'll learn that it's a project of the Employment Policies Institute, which claims to be a nonprofit, nonpartisan research organization. They list a variety of scholars who they've worked with at well-known universities in the United States. So all of these things, if you just stay on the website, suggest that it's a good source of information. However, if you leave the website, you get a very different picture about about this organization. If you search for the parent organization of the Employment Policies Institute, you will discover that it's actually run by a gentleman named Rick Berman, who has been called by at least one news outlet corporate America's new scam, because they pose as think tanks, but when they really are working for corporate interests. So in this case, minimumwage.com was working for restaurants who have a clear interest in keeping the minimum wage low, so keeping wages lower for workers. This information could be discovered almost immediately, and all of the fact checkers figured it out, and they did so really quickly. In contrast, both the historians and the students struggled to find that information. So in this graphic, you can see the red figure are the fact checkers, excuse me. All of the fact checkers discovered that this website was actually being put out by a public relations firm, and they did it in approximately 3 minutes. In contrast, only 60% of the historians figured that out, and it took them much longer to do it. And only 40% of the Stanford students made that same discovery. Despite being really smart, they had trouble figuring out who was really behind this website. In contrast, the fact checkers had a different approach. They understood that in order to understand a site, they needed to leave that website. And that was one of the fundamental differences we saw between these groups of people in this study. These smart people, and I want to emphasize, we're not trying to criticize these historians or the students. They're all of us. None of us were necessarily equipped to make sense of the current information landscape. But these smart people approached the web and the source like minimumwage.com in a way similar to a print text. They read vertically. They went up and down on the web page, and they read it very closely. And then when they did do searches, they often kind of clicked randomly. Sometimes they would just click on the top search result rather than looking any deeper. This really contrasted sharply with how the professional fact checkers addressed that same set of information. The fact checkers read laterally. So if we're thinking about the browser window, they opened up new tabs and read across those tabs to find more information about the original site. Before they even read that original article from minimumwage.com, they wanted to figure out who's behind minimumwage.com. And as a result, they ignored a lot of information. They didn't read the article closely. They wanted to know whether or not they should trust it at all. And when they did do searches, they engaged in click restraint. They took 30 or 40 seconds to scan down a search results page to figure out what's the best source of information for me to start my exploration of this given site. Because their approach was motivated by a desire to conserve their attention. We are all existing in an attention economy, and there are sort of countless groups seeking to capture our attention. And what we need to do is preserve our attention and only give our time and attention to sources that are deserving of it. And that's what the professional fact checkers did. By reading laterally, by looking for who is behind that information, they found much better information. And so what we've set out to do is to turn what we saw the professional fact checkers do into a set of curriculum materials that we refer to as Civic Online Reasoning. And we focus on the term civic intentionally. We believe that these skills are critical for being a participating member of a democracy. We become informed about the crucial issues of the day by going online to find better information. The question is, do these kinds of materials actually work? We tested them in a large urban school district in the United States 2 years ago, and we were really pleased to see that in comparison to students who did not receive the Civic Online Reasoning curriculum, the students in the Civic Online Reasoning classrooms did much better. So this is a graph showing pre-test and post-test scores, and you can see that the Civic Online Reasoning students outperformed their classmates who were in regular classes. These were seniors in high school, so 17 and 18-year-olds. All of the materials from the Civic Online Reasoning curriculum are available for free on our website, which is cor.stanford.edu. And they are the materials that formed the basis for the Sorting Truth from Fiction online course that we developed in partnership with our colleagues at MIT and is going to be used as the basis for this new initiative. So we're really excited to see how people take these materials up. If you go to our website, you'll find that there are a variety of resources on it. The first is the curriculum itself. There are a whole range of lessons, all of which are delivered as Google documents, and they are also grouped into a variety of collections of materials that are assessments and also lessons together. All of the assessments are delivered as Google Forms, so you can have students complete them and you can see the results. The kinds of tasks that we used in the research that I described at the beginning of this presentation are all available online as well. So you can get a quick sense of what individuals can and can't do when it comes to evaluating sources. We also have a set of videos available that focus on trying to use these materials, as well as instructional videos for anybody that we made in collaboration with John Green, who makes a whole range of educational videos in the United States. There are also a series of short videos demonstrating what these kinds of materials can look like in American classrooms. Like I said, we're so excited to see these materials being used in the Brazilian context. If anybody has questions about these resources or about the research that is behind them, please don't hesitate to reach out. I would love to continue the conversation beyond this webinar. My email is here, as is the website for those Civic Online Reasoning materials. Again, thanks so much for joining us, and I look forward to the questions at the end of the session.
Colocamos um pequeno resumo da fala do Joy em português, mas como vocês viram também no YouTube, vocês estão acompanhando para quem não tem tanta familiaridade com o inglês falado, tá? E passo a palavra para o nosso próximo palestrante, Joshua.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Joel, for providing some of the context for the online course that we developed. So, if you could put on the next slide. So, in the summer of 2020, we were approached by Joel and his colleagues at the Stanford History Education Group about adapting the Civic Online Reasoning curriculum into an online course for teachers. So just a little bit of context about my group where I work at MIT. One of the things that we do is we develop what's called massive open online courses, or MOOCs. So these are free open courses that anyone can sign up for, that can be accessed through the edX platform. And the idea is that we wanted to use the power and access of this platform to make these materials more available to teachers. And additionally, we wanted to think about how can we actually prepare teachers to teach students using this curriculum. So, the curriculum materials are great, and we wanted to provide teachers with additional support to think about how can I take these materials and use them with their students. So we originally launched the course in September of 2020, and then we actually relaunched the course in May of 2021 with a few updates. The course is currently available now. You can either access it on the edX platform, or in the MIT Open Learning Library. And if somebody could put the links in the chat from the slide deck, I would appreciate that. Right now, the courses are currently all in English. And so one of the things we are going to talk about is sort of some of our plans in order to make these more accessible to a broader audience. If you could put on the next slide. So what is in the course? So the course, we use a number of different media sources in order to present the material. We have expert videos from some of the creators of the Civic Online Reasoning curriculum that talks about the research behind it and sort of how these ideas can be applied in practice. We have interviews with teachers who've used this curriculum in their classroom, highlighting some of the challenges that they face and some of the ways that they've made these materials accessible to students. We developed a set of simulations and activities that allow you to actually apply these concepts in a simulated environment. So we provide examples and we give you sort of mock student responses, and I have you respond, how would you respond to a student who said this type of thing? How can you evaluate these student responses? And finally, we've made links to the Civic Online Reasoning website where they have all the materials that you can take and use them in your own classroom. The course was set up as asynchronous, so you could do it on your own timeline. Generally, we find that it takes people about 4 weeks to finish the course, and it takes about 2 to 4 hours per week. So it's definitely something manageable if someone is also working full-time as a teacher. We wanted to make sure that we weren't overburdening people with a lot of additional work. We wanted to make it accessible to a broad range of people. If you could do the next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about the global reach of the course. So all of our courses, again, are free and available on the edX website. We've had over 8,000 people register, and altogether they've logged nearly 200,000 minutes in the course platform. We've had people from 117 countries, including from Brazil. So we have a pretty wide sort of range, although what we found is that we're primarily concentrated, not surprisingly, in the United States. And this is partly because it's currently only in English, and because many of the examples are drawing on examples from the US context. So one of the things we're thinking about is how can we, create a version that's not just translated, but is also culturally adapted to the Brazilian context, and make sure that we're including Brazilian examples in the course. And now I will hand it over to my colleague Marvez, who's going to talk a little bit about some of the research that we've done about the Civic Online Reasoning course. Before that, Natasha will be providing translation into Portuguese.
Olá, pessoal. Então, vou traduzir a parte que o Josh acabou de explicar, que é a origem e a base do Civic Online Reasoning Course. Então, o core que vocês ficam vendo aí nos slides significa Civic Online Reasoning, que é basicamente uma ferramenta para distinguir ficção de verdade online. É um curso gratuito e aberto ao público, inaugurado em setembro de 2020 e reaberto em maio de 2021. Você aprenda com ferramentas para identificar desinformações online de maneira rápida e eficaz, usando estratégias desenvolvidas com verificadores de fatos profissionais. E com essas ferramentas, você pode ensinar seus alunos. Atualmente, está disponível em inglês pela edX, a plataforma edX, e também pela MIT Open Learning Library. É gratuito, como mencionamos, e aberto a todos. O curso inclui, se vocês puderem, if you guys can go back to the previous, to two slides previous. Yeah. Então, o curso inclui, você está vendo aqui na parte esquerda, vídeos de especialistas sobre verificar fatos online, entrevistas com professoras que estão usando essas ferramentas, simulações e atividades, para testar, né, o aluno ou o professor fazendo o curso testar se eles estão entendendo bem como usar essas ferramentas, e também avaliações de alunos. If you can go to the next slide, please. O que mais? O curso é assíncrono e geralmente leva 4 semanas para ser concluído. É mais ou menos 2 a 4 horas por semana. And then the previous slide with the world map. E a última coisa que ia falar, if we can go back one slide, é que existem participantes no mundo inteiro, em mais de 100 países, 117 países, e inclusive 51 pessoas que já usaram o curso no Brasil. A razão por qual tem mais participantes nos Estados Unidos não é só pelo fato de estar em inglês, o curso, mas também os exemplos com fake news e a desinformação são relevantes mais ao conteúdo ou contexto americano. Então, o nosso projeto é encontrar exemplos que é mais relevante culturalmente ao Brasil. Esse faz parte do nosso projeto, que vamos discutir mais tarde. Agora eu vou passar para minha colega Marvez, que vai explicar o resultado da pesquisa sobre o Civic Online Reasoning course.
Okay, thank you, Natasha. I'm really excited to talk with everyone today about some of our research we did, both in a performance task simulation and on a survey we had participants complete. So participants completed 2 performance assessment tasks at the start of the end of the course. And in this task, we showed participants examples of student work, because we want to help teachers prepare to analyze and evaluate student work and how they can work with this curriculum with their students. So our 3 tasks were specifically on determining the reliability of a source using lateral reading, or the act of opening a new tab and researching who or what is behind the information. Comparing the reliability of a .edu source compared to Wikipedia. This is sensing if people know enough about domain names and their reliability, or if they're not reliable. And analyze the reliability of a video from social media. Next slide, please. So these are some of the stimuli that we showed in one of the performance assessments. So there were 3 tasks in each of the 2 performance assessments. And on the first one, we showed people the co2science.org webpage that Joel talked about earlier. It's about climate science. And then when we're comparing .edu versus Wikipedia, our first stimuli was about gun politics. And then our second one, we showed a video from Facebook, which alleged voter fraud, but is actually not showing voter fraud in the United States. So these are our 3 types of stimuli that we looked at in the assessments. Next slide, please. So our overall results is that participants improved in their ability to use Civic Online Reasoning to identify pieces of misinformation, and participants could more easily identify the best teaching practices around Civic Online Reasoning skills. They moved away from these older checklist messages, such as things like looking at the domain name or not trusting Wikipedia. And participants could now identify skills that they needed to combat misinformation. Next slide, please. So here we have some of the questions that we ask on our pre and post survey of participants. Participants completed a survey at the start of the course and then at the end of the course. And we found that participants were much less likely to say that teachers should use practices that are not aligned with Civic Online Reasoning practices. For instance, in the 5th panel, we asked participants, should they avoid consulting Wikipedia since anyone can edit the articles? And on the pre, 52% of participants said you should definitely avoid Wikipedia. And on the post, only 13% said so. So we saw this real shift in mindsets about what we can do to combat misinformation online. And I'll pass it on for the Portuguese translation. Thank you.
Oi, mais uma vez, pessoal. Aqui é a Natasha, eu vou fazer uma tradução do resultado da pesquisa que a MIT faz sobre o curso. Então, não só desenvolveram o curso Civic Online Reasoning, mas também estão sempre avaliando a eficácia desse curso. Então, um resumo dos resultados da pesquisa sobre o Civic Online Reasoning é o seguinte: os participantes do curso, muitos sendo professores, melhoraram sua habilidade de usar o raciocínio cívico online para identificar desinformação, coisa que podem depois passar para seus alunos. Pulando uma parte aqui, esse slide está antigo, vamos no terceiro ponto. Os participantes puderam identificar mais facilmente as melhores práticas de ensino em torno das habilidades de raciocínio online do Civic. Desculpa, tá aqui um slide que não foi corrigido, mas basicamente melhoraram a habilidade dos participantes a identificar facilmente online o que é e não é ficção. E, finalmente, os participantes puderam identificar as habilidades necessárias para combater a desinformação, mas o resultado da pesquisa mostrou que precisarão de mais prática na implementação das habilidades. Ou seja, esse curso é um bom começo, mas é só um começo. E agora eu vou passar, acredito que para Yuri e Daisy, para falar um pouco sobre como vai ser a versão portuguesa desse programa.
Boa noite a todos. Eu sou Daisy e também sou uma daquelas 51 alunas do Brasil que realizou o curso. E vou falar um pouquinho sobre a experiência que eu tive, né? Então, nesse gráfico, inicialmente, nós temos aqui, de 15 de dezembro de 2019 a 16 de outubro de 2021, as buscas no Google pelas palavras coronavírus, em rosa, e pela palavra vacina, em roxo. Então, no início da pandemia, né, logo no início de 2020, a gente teve várias informações, várias pessoas buscando informações, e várias informações e desinformações sobre tratamentos, possíveis curas da Covid-19. E aí, dentro dessa busca, eu também procurei me informar como que eu poderia checar essas informações, né? E em maio de 2021, eu tive acesso ao curso da edX. Inicialmente, eu tive acesso à página do Core, que o Joel colocou. Pode voltar. E aí, depois, eu me inscrevi nessa newsletter para fazer o curso e realizei o curso. E aí, no final, aqui, a gente tem esse aumento de busca por vacina, e a gente também teve muita informação sobre vacina, como, por exemplo, desse médico que estava exigindo revacinação, e esse médico tinha o nome da clínica atrás, e quando eu fui buscar essa informação utilizando as estratégias core, eu vi que esse médico, ele era candidato a vereador. Esse vídeo ele foi divulgado antes das eleições, então ele tinha um interesse de ser divulgado, né, mas felizmente ele não ganhou as eleições, e eu vou passar e colocar mais um exemplo que eu utilizei as estratégias do core. Então, utilizando as estratégias do core, a gente tem 3 perguntas a serem respondidas. Quem está por trás da informação, quais são as evidências e o que outras fontes dizem? E, como foi já demonstrado nos slides anteriores, a verificação de vídeos, ela é muito importante porque o vídeo, ele leva uma credibilidade muito grande, as pessoas tendem a acreditar mais em vídeos do que em informação em texto. Esse foi um vídeo que está disponível no YouTube e que afirma que a posse de armas ajuda a diminuir roubos no campo. Esse erro aí do diminuir é da própria reportagem. E aí, procurando informações sobre isso, eu cheguei a um site da Confederação de Caça e Tiro Rural, que foi o primeiro site a divulgar essa informação sobre que a posse de arma ajudava a diminuir roubos. E e utilizando a estratégia de leitura lateral, que é sair do YouTube, né, do site, e procurar informações no Google, eu vi que evidências apontavam que outras medidas foram tomadas para reduzir os roubos no campo, em Goiás, que era o que estava dizendo nesse vídeo. Outras fontes copiavam exatamente a mesma informação da Confederação de Caça e Tiro Rural, que tinham algum interesse nessa informação, mas eu também localizei na terceira página, ou seja, eu utilizei a estratégia de click restrain, que é não clicar nos primeiros resultados do Google, mas selecionar qual informação que vai ser relevante, e essa página era do governo e explicava que essa redução estava associada a várias medidas que o governo de Goiás tomou para poder reduzir esses roubos no campo. Bom, então, pode passar o slide. Falando um pouco sobre o curso no Brasil, realizando o curso da edX, eu entrei em contato através do fórum, e eu e o Caio entramos em contato e tivemos aí acesso ao Joshua, e nós começamos a nos reunir para poder realizar esse projeto aqui no Brasil, que seria adaptar esse curso de aprendizagem digital e de desinformação online para o Brasil, para não só traduzir esse curso, mas adaptar os exemplos que esse curso utilizava, que são exemplos dos Estados Unidos, aqui para o Brasil. Então, o objetivo geral do curso é promover a aprendizagem digital sobre desinformação online para educadores brasileiros e para a comunidade em geral, popularizar estratégias de checagem de informação, disponibilizar palestras, cursos online e materiais gratuitos, e também desenvolver estudos avaliando os efeitos dessas intervenções, como já tem sido realizado lá pelo MIT. E finalizando, a nossa proposta de projeto, ela visa tanto um projeto de extensão, no qual vai ser realizado, iniciando agora no ano de 2022, a tradução do curso pela plataforma edX, incluindo exemplos aí do Brasil, da nossa realidade, também projetos de ensino, incluindo essas estratégias core em cursos de licenciatura, visando atingir aí como público-alvo educadores e professores, e, num segundo momento, também esses estudantes, e um projeto também de pesquisa, onde a gente vai poder avaliar como que foi realizada essa intervenção, esses treinamentos dos cursos, antes e após, e qual que foi a efetividade dessas intervenções em melhorar essa checagem de informações.
Muito bom, Daisy. Então, pessoal, como você está entendendo, esse é o passo inicial, né, dessa proposta de uma parceria para transformar esse curso de raciocínio Civic Online e adaptar para a realidade brasileira. Já tem um grupo, né, que se formou entre os alunos brasileiros do curso, o Caio, a Daisy, etc., e já tem várias pessoas que querem aderir, tanto entre os docentes do AMEREC, quanto entre professores da rede básica. Inclusive, acabamos de receber vários proposta de colaboração, e tanto entre os docentes da UFMG e do América. Então, é essa a fase em que nós estamos buscando voluntário para auxiliar na tradução e parceiro para auxiliar na parte de ensino e pesquisa, basicamente. Então, é esse que é o foco de hoje. Em janeiro, pensamos fazer um webinar bem maior, explicando todos os detalhes do curso, da metodologia, da proposta, da leitura lateral, que inclusive vamos comentar agora na discussão, e esse será totalmente bilíngue. Então, vamos ter tradução simultânea, 2 canais de áudios, então todo mundo pode ouvir na língua que prefere, e a partir daí daremos o start para a construção desse curso no Brasil, em parceria com as instituições brasileiras e de fora que querem participar. Então, eu vou devolver a palavra para Joshua, está coordenando isso tudo, e a seguir vamos abrir para... Tem já várias perguntas que vocês fizeram, tá? Vamos daqui a pouco abrir para o debate, vocês podem continuar colocando suas questões e perguntas, que a gente daqui a pouco vai abrir para nossos palestrantes. With you, Joshua.
Thank you, Yuri, and thank you, everyone. I've been following some of the comments in YouTube, and just seeing all the enthusiasm is very exciting. We would like to both get your feedback on this session, and also find ways to stay in touch. If you're interested in this project, if you want to get updates as it develops, you're interested in getting involved in some capacity, please fill out the survey. Someone will also put the link in the chat. This will allow us to, just find out how the session went, and also hopefully sort of keep people updated as we start to develop the course for the Brazilian context. And now, Yuri, I think we'll have some time for questions and answers. Great.
Vamos dar minuto. Josh, let's give a minute for the people to fill the questionnaire. And in the while, we begin to select the question. Então, pessoal, por favor, preencha o survey, que é muito curto e ajuda muito a gente a avançar nesse planejamento da adaptação brasileira desse material, junto com o formulário também brevíssimo, que é do certificado de participação. Aqui. So we can stop this. And we are back online. Fine. Perfect. So, well, vamos começar a discussão. Eu vi que alguns colocaram questões em português, que eu vou traduzir para nossos convidados, e começando pelos obstáculos e as dificuldades, eu diria que podemos começar. Josh and Joe, first, a question for you too. Luciana says, a great deal of people think that checking information is a lot of hard work. How would you engage this public? How to understand them the importance of checking information? Is it worthwhile for common people to check information? This is linked with another question by Esteban, who say, well, this is very okay for in general, but the denialists, people who already believe in some conspiracy theory, for example, how would you touch these people? How would you convince them to make such a kind of training?
Yeah, I think those are both really excellent questions. I'll take up the first one about how do we encourage people to do it. I think part of what we want to do is to show folks that these strategies that we saw the fact checkers using can be deployed quickly. It doesn't take long to just turn to the web and search about a website. So rather than reading closely that article from the website that was actually run by a public relations firm, if you just search for it online, in 30 seconds, you have a ton of information. And then you can just say, I don't want to spend time with that website and keep going, right? Or just to say, if there isn't enough information, to leave it behind and go on. But part of what we want to have people do is not to just accept information at face value. And that's what we see so often. And so it doesn't require people to become professional fact checkers. Instead, we want people to have a slightly different orientation to information online and to be wondering, who's behind this? Where's this information coming from? And then if we did that, we would eliminate a lot of the problems that we see in terms of the kinds of sources that trick people. And the reality is that the majority of folks online, they don't want to be misled. They'd like to find better information, but they don't necessarily have the tools to do that well. And then the second piece, I think is, we're never going to get everybody to be able to agree on the exact information that they want to find. And so, I think initially we want to start with the searchers of goodwill, people who are committed to trying to find information and want to do that, but aren't sure how to do it. And then begin to think about, other strategies for helping other people who may be less inclined to do so. What are the kinds of interactions that we could have with those people, particularly with individuals they trust, family members or friends who might be able to help convince them in other directions. But initially, I think our goal should be to make sure that people who want to find good information online have the tools to do that and have a sense of how they can use them effectively.
The one thing I would add, that was a great response, Joel. One additional thing about the course is that we're thinking a lot about how to target the next generation. So students who are in school right now, they're the ones who are going to be the next generation of people who are going to be online. And as Joel mentioned, they don't necessarily, just because you use a computer or you are online doesn't mean you understand how to evaluate misinformation. And so we think it's really important to prepare students in those particular skills, and in this course to prepare teachers to teach these skills to students.
Fine. Agora tem duas perguntas ligadas à questão escolar. Two questions about education school. One is from Lucia, and she says to put everything in condition to evaluating information, online information, seems to me a structural job in educational terms. It's a structural, you have to work to change the structure of education. So strictly linked to the educational process in basic education. This is for Joe. What do you think about this? How to connect with the structure of education? And Isabella has a similar but opposite question. She says, this project, I think this is more for Joshua, this project is for students, but this information circulates in great scale also between older people. So do you have a plan to include these publics too in some moments, or they are already included, they already participate in the course, or is it made young people and teachers?
So I can start with the question about educational structures. We agree that certainly if we want to take this on, it's going to require some shifts in the way that our educational system is set up. That doesn't mean that we suddenly need to have a course that is just about teaching online information, but it does mean that we got to figure out ways to integrate this kind of instruction into the existing structure of schooling. So if we are asking students to go online to do a little research project during math class or science class, we want to make sure that they're being asked to think about why the sources that they're using are trustworthy. And similarly, that if they're in history class and they're doing a research project, that they are being told about how to do lateral reading, to leave an unfamiliar website and to look for other sources, so that students are hearing this and that message is being reinforced. And Josh can talk about the second question more, but I would just mention as well that we agree that, that this kind of work is focusing on students, but we need to think about the broader public as well. And actually, our two groups at MIT and Stanford are currently working on another project that is explicitly focused on that question in the United States, is how can we turn from what we do in schools and replicate that with the public at large. And so we're now trying to figure out how we can create materials that would reach a much larger audience outside of school settings. So that's ongoing work that is actually funded by the US government right now. So we hope to have more information about how to think about doing that over the course of the next year.
So in response to the question about could this work for a different population, definitely in the course there were people who weren't necessarily educators or were taking the course for their own learning, or they were taking the course because they're working with in settings where these issues are coming up and they want to figure out how to address it. I know I've heard from many people that they hear things from family members, and how do you combat something you see on WhatsApp or one of those other settings. And so I think this course, the strategies that Joel and the Civic Online Reasoning team have developed can be applied across a variety of settings. And one of the things I think we're interested in learning more about and also designing is thinking about what are the specific issues that are happening right now in Brazil, and how can we adapt the course to be responsive to those issues. So your feedback and your thoughts are really highly valued.
Fine. We have a lot of questions that I will tell you later about detail of what core is, who idealized this, who invented this, and what some example of lateral reading. But before, I have a question about political polarization. That is a strong factor in disinformation circulation. So Esteban asked, maybe this question could be for Marves too, because of the test, the pre and post-test evaluation. Esteban asked, did you also study how political polarization or political position of the students affect the strategy of checking information they use? Or this variable of political position and polarization is not present in the evaluation of how do people check their information?
Sure. So one of the things we noticed in our data analysis of this course is that we had over 90% more liberal participants and only about 10% conservative participants. So there's definitely a different political ideologies going on in our sample. Additionally, in the first run of the course, 5 of the stimuli participants saw were more targeted towards liberal participants leaning to not believe it. So that's definitely something interesting we want to explore in the future, especially about misinformation that people maybe on the left side of the political aisle are likely to fall for as well. I think that would be a really interesting thing to look at. But we did not specifically look at, do people with different political beliefs have different initial fact-checking strategies? But that sounds like a really interesting question too.
Do you want to add something, Joshua?
No, I think Marves covered it. I think it's definitely an area that we're interested in exploring more and thinking about how, I think I agree that, misinformation is not there's partisan misinformation on both sides of the spectrum. So thinking about how to design interventions that, allow people to detect particularly ones that they have a vested desire in believing, I think it is important.
Yeah. Of course, even if actually the strategies of cherry picking or checking or not checking information can be different depending of people's political position on each case. So maybe climate change can be different. People can use different strategies to check information because it's so much politicized than other topics. So could be interesting. Now, I have an interesting question by Ludmila that she asked about the concept of core. This was invented by you, researchers of present here, or it's a reflection that with other authors and so who invented Civic Online Reasoning and on which literature. And this is joined with some commentaries and comments I saw of people asking to understand better what is lateral reading. You actually explained this, but you can summarize again, maybe.
Sure. So the Civic Online Reasoning curriculum materials were developed by my colleagues and I at the Stanford History Education Group at Stanford University. So we are the group that did the research with the professional fact checkers, as well as developed and tested the curriculum. And then we collaborated with Marvez, Josh, and colleagues at MIT to develop the Civic Online Reasoning course that we ran and is going to be the basis for this new course in Brazil. The skill of lateral reading, the thing that we saw the fact checkers using to find better information, is that the move of when you encounter an unfamiliar site, don't spend time reading that site, but instead open up a new browser tab and search for information about that original site. So instead of reading up and down on the article itself, open that tab and read across those tabs, to read laterally, and essentially to turn to the web to understand that original source. We have the incredible power of the internet at our fingertips, and we should use it. Rather than just accepting sources at face value, we should just pause and say, what do other sources say about this original site? Is it trustworthy? So it's the act of getting off of an unfamiliar site, determining quickly. And again, I want to emphasize that it's quick. This is not supposed to be sort of a very extended process. Quickly leaving a site and then seeing what other information can I find to determine whether or not I should give my attention to it. And after 30 seconds or a minute, do I want to read it? Or if I have some doubts, I should go somewhere else. That's the incredible thing about the internet, is there's so many sources. Given that there's so many sources, if you have doubts about a given site, you should just go somewhere else.
Fine. And there was one more question. I think we are going to our end. But before, I want to speak a bit in Portuguese, because this last question is also to us, because it's about the Brazilian situation. And I want to thank, because I see that in our public there are a lot of teachers and professors, both of basic and high school and university school. Então, eu queria agradecer a presença. Estou vendo que tem vários educadores, educadoras, docentes, professores, que todos estão apreciando essa ideia, né, de dar ferramentas também para a educação, para formar. E queria dizer que isso também responde um pouco a essas questões que vários de vocês colocaram, de como alcançar esses públicos que estão fora da bolha dos que querem ou estão em condição de se informar e checar. É por isso que um dos públicos-alvos centrais é a escola. Tá? Exatamente a escola, porque a escola forma todas as pessoas. Então, não se trata apenas de dar ferramentas para quem quiser fazer o curso, mas se trata de fornecer ferramenta para as educadoras e nas escolas, para que ela seja multiplicada entre todos os alunos, não apenas as pessoas que têm interesse ou tempo ou capacidade para fazer o próprio curso. Então, a conexão com a escola é estrutural, é fundamental nesse curso, e nós esperamos de fortalecê-la também na versão brasileira, com a conexão, né, com os docentes, com as direções, com as secretarias, e assim por diante. But the Brazilian question is by Luciana, and it poses another political kind of question, that is, information transparency is an issue in Brazil. So we have a lot of problem about concentration of media, in very few private corporations. We don't have a strong public media like I have in Europe, for example. I'm European, and the question if we think that it could be harder for Brazilian students to evaluate online information than is for American students. So and as you can say some very brief things about the Brazilian situation, but of course the question is for you too, to this comparison. And in my opinion, Luciana, information transparency is a huge and increasing problem all over the world, but with different regulation and different policies in every region. So in Italy, we have some strict rule about concentration of the media, about transparency. There are some attempts to make a common European Union regulation for transparency, especially in social network, but it's a big problem not only in Brazil, in my opinion. But of course, in Brazil, we have a very strong history of a few diversity in the big media scenario and ecosystem, the big media platform, very little diversity and very little access for people, for reader, to the transparency of information. So yes, it is a problem we should cope with in the formulation of a Brazilian course. It's a discussion that should be done, in my opinion. I don't think that for an American student would be not a problem. I don't know if it's so smaller or bigger, but I think it's a common problem, because it's the first example that Joshua showed was, I mean, it's not always simple to distinguish propaganda and think tank from science communication to the public, or popular science or science education. It's not always simple to distinguish, to recognize a conflict of interest in our communication. So it's a common problem, I think.
I just had some comment, because some of the tools that we saw in the edX course are very similar to Brazilian comments, like the gun problems and the problems, the climate and political problems. It's very similar. And some English examples, they translate to Portuguese, and they release as a fake news here. Sorry.
And I would just add, that we have done some work with colleagues in India, actually, and created a version of our materials there as well. And we've seen similar patterns there in terms of the kinds of mistakes that people are making. That was a set of materials that were designed for not use in schools, but for the general public. And, certainly the details are different, right, in terms of each country. And I think that's why it's so crucial to adapt the materials for the particular context. But this basic idea about accepting information on at its face value is the same in India and the United States. That was the thing that we saw over and over again in both places, that people said, like, oh, here's an image, it must be true. And certainly it'll be interesting to see what you all experience in Brazil. But I think there are a lot of similarities that we've seen so far. And so I think that that basic idea of asking a question, where's information coming from, is really powerful. But that it's also really important to adapt the materials to make sure that they match the particular context. So I'm excited to see this work and also to watch it as it develops.
Fine. Joshua or Marves, if you want to add something.
Yeah, I agree with what everyone's saying, that I think it is a global issue, and I think that a lot of the mistakes that people make are probably similar across contexts. I think there are obviously differences, and part of the goal in this project is to think about, some of the subtleties of the differences, and think about how can we make materials that are relevant specifically for Brazil.
Yeah, and I think the problem is probably the same like everywhere in every country. We make similar mistakes about misinformation. We believe what we see at face value. But one thing I think is going to be really interesting to explore is how different countries and places use different platforms. We've heard from our great collaborators that WhatsApp is frequently used in Brazil to spread information and misinformation. So that'll be another great area to explore, I think.
Fine. So I think we are running to our end. So I will give the word to each one of you to make some brief conclusive consideration, if you want. And eu quero agradecer todos os que foram presentes e convido de novo para preencherem tanto o link da lista de presentes, entre aspas, para o certificado da participação nesse seminário, quanto o link da mini survey, né, da mini enquete, que é sobre a questão de hoje e sobre o curso, que isso vai ajudar muito a entender o interesse e as potencialidades para a gente desenvolver esse curso aqui no Brasil. Tá? E acho que é isso, né, Dez? Se você quer acrescentar alguma coisa?
Eu queria deixar o convite para todos que quiserem participar, né, do projeto, que deve iniciar agora em 2022, serão todos muito bem-vindos. Quanto mais forças a gente puder unir, né, contra essa checagem de informação, e também só comentar que esse curso, ele é um curso não só teórico, é um curso prático. Então, durante o curso, você consegue já desenvolver essas estratégias através das práticas, e isso desenvolve uma autonomia muito grande. Então, eu acho que mesmo as pessoas negacionistas, elas vão ser capazes de ir lá e checar, e elas vão, né, chegar a essa informação.
Além de que um aspecto central de uma democracia deliberativa, participativa, é as pessoas, digamos, se acostumarem a afirmar coisas com base em argumentos e raciocínio. Então, uma vez que a forma de argumentar e raciocinar começa a se difundir, independente das posições eventualmente radicalizadas ou da crença negacionista de um vez que outro, começa a se fortalecer um debate público mais qualificado, no sentido que certos argumentos são baseados em xingamento, ou ódio, ou calúnia, vão começar a funcionar menos, mesmo nas redes sociais mais inflamadas. Então, uma ferramenta, digamos, de uma pedagogia, digamos, coletiva para a própria democracia, eu acho. Então, tem um papel bastante importante essa ferramenta, independente de até que ponto vai chegar em cada um dos negacionistas, mas como processo coletivo de aprendizado e de reeducação de um debate deliberativo, ou seja, em que as pessoas divergem, brigam, mas coincidem, concordam sobre o fato que as afirmações têm que ser justificadas com argumento ou raciocínio, não só com xingamentos ou calúnias tiradas, quem sabe de qual fonte. Então, acho que isso é muito importante. Gilvana is one among several teachers here and colleagues, and say, we educators have a very important role in training and in the formation of a critical citizen and critical thinking. And I perfectly agree, and I think that's why school and teachers are a very crucial part of this kind of projects and activity, joined with, of course, the political dimension of insisting in novel and more adequate regulation for online communication, and join with more and more research to understand which factor affect more people in the moment that they try to check or not check an information. So I give you the word for some final consideration, and I want to thank all the people who followed us until now, and repeat that we are starting this project, this Brazilian version of CORE, and we are open to partnership and volunteers, both to translate and make the research and so on. So we will briefly enter in contact with people who are filling the survey. Joshua, Marvez, and Joel, for your final words.
Thank you, everyone, for joining. It was a pleasure getting to meet all of you and talk a little bit about the course. I'm very excited to collaborate together in the future.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. It was really great to get to speak today.
Thanks for taking the time, and please don't hesitate to reach out if we can help in any way as you're diving into these resources. We're excited to see what comes of this project.
Fine. Muito obrigado a todas e todas. Acabo de ver, eu peço muita desculpa por não ter participado hoje, mas acho que chegaram bem no finalzinho, tem mais 2 questões, tá? E prometo que retomaremos em breve, mas é sobre desigualdade social, ou seja, e quem não tem acesso à internet, e tem muitos milhões de pessoas que não têm, o que vai ser? E outra questão política é como se faz isso, esse tipo de trabalho em momentos em que a própria política governamental não favorece de jeito nenhum a informação, mas favorece a desinformação. So I was saying that there are 2 last-minute comments by our public, but that we are promising that we will take again this issue in America and our project. But I want to put for you, if you want to give some very brief words. One is about inequality. So millions of people actually in Brazil do not have good access to internet. So disinformation comes even if you don't have good access to internet, because some WhatsApp, some neighbor and so on, but information not so much. It's much more difficult to check information or to make a lateral reading if you do not have access. So we had huge problems in Brazil during pandemics because 10 millions of young people went home and they couldn't access school anymore. So this information had a very fertile humus to proliferate. So if there is also some kind of reflection from USA about this inequality problem and digital gap. And the other question is also political, I would say, from Isabelle, that disinformation is also strongly linked today to the demoralization of science, attacks against science or against university or against intellectuals. And in Brazil, this was systematically made by politicians themselves. So how can you fight disinformation if public policy actually are directed in incentivating, in increasing disinformation over information? So I think there are two very difficult questions. So, but if you want to make some brief comments about one or two of them, you are welcome. Joel, after Marves, if you want, and Joshua.
I would just say I think that this is a key issue is about access as well, right? It's about how do you ensure that individuals are able to find information. It's an issue of equity, and we need to make sure that individuals have access both to the internet to find credible information, and then also to make sure that we provide them with the tools to find good information when they do go online, and so that it's both one of the technology and then also the human technology of making sense of that information, and that it is fundamentally about equity. And so I think it's crucial to take on both of those things so that people can get online and then also are equipped with tools to make good decisions based on the information that they find there.
Marves, if you want to add something or just say goodbye, and Joshua, the same thing.
Yeah, I definitely agree with Joel. It's a two-part issue. One thing, getting people online so that they can access better opportunities, such as education online during pandemics or on platforms like edX or other online platforms. And then once people are there, how can we get them better equipped to have better digital literacy?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think one of the challenges that we've identified in other research is that just because something is online or free doesn't mean it's accessible to everyone. And often it, overly benefits people who already have a lot of access to resources. So that's definitely a consideration, something we should really be thinking about is how do we make stuff accessible to a broader population? Is that, having printed versions that we could disseminate? Is that having some other ways that we communicate through apps? So it's definitely something we will be thinking about.
Fine. So I want to thank you very, very much, so much, our wonderful guest with this wonderful discussion and so important. I would like to say that both America and I suppose also the Federal University of Minas Gerais, we are very happy and very proud to be part of this project in Brazil, maybe later in Latin America too. So we will make our part, maybe with our partnership. And America is our science communication course for both teachers and journalists and science communicators in general. And America is a word in an Indian language of this region that means actually contact or to poke each other. So we teach science communication not as a top-down approach, but as a democratic approach, how to build actually the social appropriation of knowledge by people. So this is perfectly coherent with project like CORE, that is how to equip people with democratic skills and abilities and power also to take decision. And this is our approach in science communication teaching in general. Quero agradecer também ao nosso público que ficou aqui até agora, e nós vamos retomar essa discussão. Quem não conhecia ainda o America, além das disciplinas, dos cursos, que obviamente são para nossos alunos, nesse canal vocês vão encontrar vários seminários e lives que a gente vai fazer abertas a todas e todos, então nos sigam, né, porque vai ter várias coisas esse ano bem interessantes, sobre divulgação científica, ciência e racismo, sobre divulgação científica, participação popular, etc. Então, estão bem-vindos os não alunos também. Quero agradecer de novo a presença de tantos que eu reconheci, educadores e professores, que sacaram a importância, né, desse tipo de assunto, né, para a educação, e sacaram quanto importante é a escola e a educação, os educadores são para o próprio America. Então, thank you, everyone, and see you in the next opportunities. So, tchau, tchau, boa noite a todas e todos, e obrigado.